You can relax now that you're out of the disturber. We're going to have some fun. Haha. My husband whispered into his niece's ear. The person in the way, as my husband put it, was my daughter. I had to leave home on an urgent business trip. I was anxious about being away from my daughter for a few days, but my husband sent me off, telling me to go in peace. My daughter and my husband usually spend a lot of time together, so I wasn't worried about leaving her in his care. However, recently my daughter has been acting somewhat strangely. In hindsight, I should have dug deeper into the feelings I felt at this time. Mom, don't go to work. I am an unfit mother for not being able to recognize the SOS as best I could from my daughter, who clung to my leg and refused to move away. I had no idea that my husband would lock my daughter in a storage room and go on a trip with my niece. I will never be able to forgive my husband for what he did to my daughter and niece. My name is Tara. I married my husband of the same age when I became pregnant with my daughter Stella, who will be 5 this year. I met my husband through a very ordinary introduction by a friend. At the time, my husband was working for a toy manufacturer because of his love for children, and I had just been selected for my first project at work. We were both busy with work and had no idea that we were going to get married. But then I found out I was pregnant with our daughter. If I gave birth, I would have to take maternity leave and would be removed from the project I was working on. It was an opportunity that was available to me, but I had already seen a number of people in my company do this, and I felt miserable and unsure about my future. But in my distress, my husband said to me, "I'll quit my job and become a full-time husband." My husband took up his current job because he wanted his children to one day be able to use the toys he had been involved in producing. My husband had already been involved in the development of several products, which were actually sold. "I want you to make my dream come true. Let's get married, Tara." My husband's words made me determined to have my daughter. I explained the situation to the company and returned to work 3 months after giving birth. Despite some blanks, I managed to work on the project until the end, which was a valuable experience for me. Returning to work immediately after childbirth was often difficult, but thinking about my husband and lovely daughter waiting for me at home made me work harder than ever. And now I am struggling every day as the leader of a newly launched project. On weekdays, I leave work on time by bringing work home and tries to spend as much time with my daughter as possible, but sometimes I have to work on holidays or go on business trips. Even at such times, my daughter does not look lonely and says encouragingly, "Be sure to work hard." She says encouragingly. Although being a full-time house husband was still not well understood in some parts of the world, our family did our respective roles and lived happily together. Then one day, my sister-in-law came to me for advice about her divorce. Her sister-in-law's husband is 10 years older than her, and they have often clashed because of their different ways of thinking. Recently, it escalated and she was forced to raise her hand to him, which led to the divorce. "It's been a tough time for you, sister-in-law." "Not at all. It's rather refreshing. I don't have to see my daughter, Amelia, crying anymore." My sister-in-law has a daughter, Amelia, who will be 11 this year. When my sister-in-law was attacked by her ex-husband, my niece witnessed it and started crying, and her ex-husband stopped his violence towards her, but she feared that one day his violence would be directed at my niece as well, so she decided to divorce him. After hearing her story, my husband said, "If you have any problems, just tell me anything. I'm always at home," as if in jest, which made me laugh. However, I nodded my head broadly at my husband's words about telling me anything. She had persuaded my reluctant parents-in-laws when my husband left the company to become a full-time house husband. Nowadays, it's not about being a man or a woman. Those who can do it will do it. Without those words from my sister-in-law, I would not have been able to build a good relationship with my parents-in-law. It is also thanks to my sister-in-law that we are living happily now. When you are in trouble, it's on both sides. You can always rely on me. Really? Thank you. Actually, I'd like to move to your neighborhood. Wouldn't that be a nuisance? Nuisance is outrageous. She said that following the divorce, she was supposed to move out of the rented flat she had rented in her ex-husband's name. I thought about going back to my parents-in-law's house, but my parents-in-law's house is an hour's drive from here, which is too far for her to commute to work, and my niece would have to change schools. As our house is within the school district of the primary school my niece attends, my sister-in-law and niece were lucky enough to move into a nearby flat that was available. Furthermore, at my husband's suggestion, my niece was to be kept at our house from after school until my sister-in-law finished work. Previously, my sister-in-law had been working part-time, but with the divorce she was to start working full-time. She was worried that her niece would be home alone when she came home from school because she would be working longer hours. She was worried that she might be overprotective of my niece, who was now in the 5th year of primary school, but it was my husband who persuaded her that it was too late to wait until something had happened. Let's at least watch her closely while she is in primary school. My husband was originally very fond of my niece and she called him Big Brother and missed him. I also convinced my sister-in-law that I wanted my niece to be my daughter's playmate, and when she was away on business, she would look after my niece at home. Thus our new life was to begin. We originally lived close to each other, so my daughter and niece also saw each other more often than they would have done as cousins. They both got used to their new lives very quickly and it seemed to be off to a good start, but then my daughter suddenly started not wanting to leave me. She had been seeing me off to work for as long as I can remember, so I thought she was completely used to being away. Is she lonely? Or is she anxious about something? I was puzzled by my daughter's attitude, which I had never seen before. Mommy's just going to work. I'll be back at night. Despite my assurances, she clung to my legs and refused to leave. What's wrong? I asked her, but she just shook her head. Amelia's sister will be here in the evening, so you won't be lonely, will you? When I said this, she put more and more pressure on her hand that gripped my leg. Whenever I am unable to do anything about it, my husband gently pulls my daughter away from me. It's all right, go to work, Mom. Here, let's say goodbye to Mommy. When my husband said this, my daughter would reluctantly wave to me. I wondered what on earth had caused my daughter to become so restless. Although I was concerned about it, I couldn't find time to spend with my daughter because of my work. When I talked to my husband about it, he was optimistic. Maybe she had a bad day at kindergarten. He was optimistic. Besides, Amelia's there too. I talked to Amelia about things that are hard for us to talk about. I don't know. I hope so. Don't worry. Look at today's photo. Her husband showed her a photo of his niece and daughter taken with his phone. It was a picture of them in the middle of talking with their mouths covered, as if they were having some kind of private conversation. I looked at it and decided to stop forcing my daughter to tell me the cause of the problem, as I thought it might indeed be easier for children to tell each other. My niece adores my daughter, saying she is like a sister to her, and I am sure her attitude is only temporary. I'm almost done with work and then I'll get paid to spend time with my daughter. I told myself that. Soon after that, I had to go on a business trip. I had to leave home for 5 days because of a sudden business trip. I was worried about my daughter, but my husband's words of encouragement, "Don't worry about it, go ahead," encouraged me to pack my bags, and 2 days later I left for my business trip. My niece had just come to visit, and my husband, daughter, and niece saw me off and I left home. I remember my husband and niece were all smiles. But how was my daughter? At the time, I had no idea that something like that would happen. By the time I boarded the bullet train, things were unfolding at home that I had not expected. My husband was getting ready to leave. My niece saw this and asked, "Stella, aren't you going with us?" She asked anxiously. Stella is going with Mom on her business trip. As soon as Mom gets back from work, it looks like they're going out together. Right. Having thus talked his niece out of it, my husband ordered his daughter to look for something. "Stella, there's something in the shed that's very important to Mom. I need you to find it for me before Mommy comes back." Stella believed him and went to the storeroom to look for an unlikely find, a small round pearl. When he confirms that Stella has entered the storeroom, he closes the door from the outside. His daughter, who had her back to the door, did not notice this. "You can relax now that you're out of the disturber. We're going to have some fun. Haha." My husband shook his niece's hand anxiously and went off on the trip. 4 days later, he returned from the trip in a good mood. He spoke to his niece, who looked downcast, saying things like, "The trip was fun." Just before unlocking the front door, he suddenly saw a shed in the corner of the garden and turned pale. It was only then that he remembered that he had left his daughter behind. No way, they'd have come out long ago. I didn't lock the door. My niece, who was listening next to him, said, "No way, you left Stella there." She was so surprised that she started to run. Not hearing him try to stop her, she went to the shed and called his daughter's name. What he and she saw was a strange liquid oozing out of the storeroom. "What the hell is this? No way." Niece rushed to open the shed door, but he stopped her. "Stop. Don't look, Amelia." "What do you mean, don't look?" "No way, Stella is." My niece turned pale and blamed him. "Why did you leave her here? You said Stella was supposed to go with Tara on her business trip." Her niece's plaintive cries echoed in the area. My husband shuddered as my niece accused him of doing this, saying, "What a thing I've done." So finally, I approached my husband from behind. where have you been?" My voice was so cold that I was horrified. I didn't know that I could be so angry that I could make such a sound. It was the same for my daughter standing next to me. Even as a child, she looked at my husband accusingly. Fearfully, my husband turned around to find me and my daughter, and froze as if frozen. "Tara, Stella." Contrary to my husband's surprise, my niece found my daughter and hugged her, crying, "Thank God, Stella. You're safe." As my niece hugged her, she took her gaze off my husband and hugged her back, as if to confirm that my niece was safe. How much have these children been pushed around by my husband? I stood there, protecting my daughter and niece from my husband. But my husband deliberately muttered to my daughter, "Thank God you are safe. Glad you're safe. You left her yourself, what are you saying now?" Stella said she'd be better off with Mom. "And why is Tara here? What happened to your business trip? You were supposed to come back tomorrow." "Heh. So you're planning to be back home before I get back? I can't believe you can think like that. Maybe this is how you usually leave my daughter behind." My husband fell silent at my words. That is the best affirmation of all. I've heard the story from Stella. Amelia will tell me her story too. I turned to my niece, who was hugging my daughter, and she looked firmly back into my eyes as if she had made up her mind and nodded. It was by chance that I was able to rescue my daughter in this way. I shudder to think what would have happened if the date of my business trip had not been changed. On the day I left for my business trip, I did indeed board the bullet train. However, I got a call that my business trip had suddenly changed and I had to get off the train and come back. Thanks to the business trip being cancelled, I was able to go straight home and arrive home earlier than my usual return time. Finally, I could talk to my daughter. I took a taxi from the station and rushed home. As I got out of the taxi and was on my way to the front door, I heard my daughter's voice. "Mom." I heard my daughter's voice. I thought she had found me and ran to me, but to my surprise, I looked downwards. To my surprise, her voice was coming from inside the storeroom. "Stella." I rushed to open the door of the storeroom and found my daughter there, sweating and sobbing. At her feet, the water-filled Super Ball I had given her was exploding. This was a toy my husband had been involved in developing when he was still working for a toy manufacturer. I had bought it for my daughter to cheer her up a little when she started to choke. She must have panicked and the door was closed and either threw it or stepped on it, causing it to burst. Oozing out of the shed was the liquid from this Super Ball bursting. Other items of her worn clothes were scattered on the floor. "What are you doing here?" I hugged my daughter, who was sobbing, and asked her. Then my daughter told me a story that made me so furious that I could call it the first time in my life. Stella told me that Daddy told her to find her mama's pearls. She's quite shocked that you left her and that she was locked up. You said I locked her in, but the door would have been unlocked. I thought I could get out on her own. Even an adult would be scared of a door being suddenly shut. You could have panicked and not been able to open it. Besides, I heard about the usual things. And I finally found out why Stella started to gag. He must have noticed the cause anyway. He was the one who had caused it, after all. Since he started taking care of my niece at home, he has been loving her only. My daughter began to feel lonely because he neglected her and tried to give his undivided attention to my niece. But she could only complain in that way because of my busy schedule. Besides, my daughter apparently knew that my niece was troubled by his attitude. The photo of the two of them having a private conversation must have been taken when they were talking about it. She really wanted to tell me about my niece and have me do something about it. But she didn't yet have the words to tell me exactly that, and she didn't know what to say to me. When she finally told me, her words were faltering, but she still worried about her niece as much as she could. What a kind girl she was, even though she had been lonely herself. I heard from her and immediately phoned my husband. But no matter how many times I called, my husband did not pick up the phone. Usually he would call back immediately, and he never answered the phone like this. Something was wrong. I thought so and contacted my sister-in-law. That's when I heard the shocking news. My husband had told my sister-in-law that he was going on a trip with our daughter and niece. My husband had contacted my sister-in-law as soon as he found out about my business trip. Tara is going on a long business trip. Stella will probably miss her during that time, so I'm thinking of taking Amelia with me on the trip. My sister-in-law was also just busy with work and was worried about not being able to take care of her daughter. My husband lied and said that my daughter and niece wanted to go to a theme park, and my sister-in-law agreed to my husband's proposal to take them. Of course, I never heard that from my husband. When I heard about this, my blood boiled. Did my husband really intend to leave my daughter home alone during that trip? I told my sister-in-law that my daughter remained at home. When I also told her that I could not contact my husband, she said she would try to call him herself, and that is where I hung up with my sister-in-law. I thought it was odd, so I went through the house, and to my surprise, it's just not right. There are a lot of leftovers in the fridge and the water heater in the bathroom is left on. Could this be so Stella can stay at home alone? Well, that's... My husband had prepared just this and tried to leave our 5-year-old daughter behind for 4 days. He was taking his niece to a theme park with him, and he said he had to hang up because it was his turn to go to the attractions. A photo of my niece alone was also sent to my sister-in-law's phone. Having confirmed that my niece was safe for the time being, my sister-in-law and I decided to wait for my husband and niece to return home, despite our anger. My husband had also sent me a photo of my daughter and niece, perhaps to create an alibi. The background was our house, so he must have sent me one taken earlier. My sister-in-law had sent me a photo of my niece playing at a theme park. It was accompanied by a white background and even an episode of the two of them having a good time. And my husband, who thought we didn't know, came home in a good mood, having forgotten all about the daughter he had left behind. Why did my husband want to travel only with my niece? Even though she had always loved him, his behavior was unusual. Of course, I am not the only one who thinks so. What the hell are you really doing? You're crazy to leave your own daughter behind and go on a trip with your niece. Sister, why are you here? Tara told me everything. My sister-in-law jumped in, out of breath. She must have run all the way here on her way home from work. When my niece saw my sister-in-law, she left my daughter and ran to her. "Mother! Amelia, I'm sorry." There, for the first time, my niece told me everything about my husband's behavior. My daughter told me that as soon as he started taking care of my niece at our house, my husband started to only care about my niece. In my daughter's eyes, this seemed to be the case, but in reality it was more of a push on my niece. He had a bizarre need to take photographs of his niece. At first, my niece smiled and agreed with my husband's words that he would send them to her mother, but gradually his behavior escalated. He started ordering her to pose like this, which my niece found strange. However, once she said no, the husband said, "I'll tell your mother," as if he was blaming his niece. I could say that Amelia is a bad girl who doesn't listen to us, so we can't take care of her anymore. I'm sure your mother would be annoyed if I did that. My niece's desire not to annoy her mother was taken against her wishes, and my husband continued to take photographs of her. Finally, he took her on a trip, just the two of them. I really didn't want to go on the trip. He held my hand and it made me feel uncomfortable. "Hey, Amelia. I don't think so. You used to be happy about it, too. You used to ask me to hold you yourself." When my sister-in-law heard what my husband said, she shouted at him, "How old are you talking about?" She shouted at him. She then hugged her daughter tightly again. Like my daughter, my niece had been putting up with my husband's behavior because she did not want to worry her mother. And he mistakenly believed that this was because his niece missed him. My sister-in-law tearfully apologized to her daughter for agreeing to the trip without any sense of danger to him. She regretted leaving her daughter in his care because she felt comfortable leaving her in his care on a regular basis. "I'm sorry, Amelia. If only your mother had been more careful." Her daughter shook her head in my sister-in-law's arms. Then, in a trembling voice, she said she never wanted to see my husband again. Hearing this, he began to panic pitifully. "Amelia, don't say that. I just want to adore you. Don't you ever go near Amelia again." "Oh, no." My sister-in-law then took the phone from my flustered husband, telling him to delete the photos he had taken. But when she looked at the folder of photos on his phone, my sister-in-law was speechless. There was an unusual amount of photos of her daughter stored there. Her daughter had an expression that barely looked like a smile, but was apparently frightened. On reflection, all the photographs my husband had sent my sister-in-law were of her daughter without her looking at the camera. My husband must have noticed the change in his niece's expression. So he sent her only things whose expressions were unknown. And yet my husband let his desires run wild and took my niece out. Disgusting. I was nauseated by my husband's abnormality. My sister-in-law also seemed unable to move, clutching his phone. We hid our daughters firmly behind each other's backs and confronted my husband. I had not the slightest intention of forgiving him for leaving my daughter behind, but I didn't want my husband anywhere near my daughter and niece anymore. That was the moment when all love and everything else vanished. No, no, listen to me. I love Amelia and of course I love Stella too. He is still making some excuse, but it only frightens my daughter and niece even more. I confronted my husband with the divorce papers I had prepared during his trip, took the luggage I had packed and left the house with my daughter. I did not want to breathe the same air as him for even a second. My sister-in-law and niece followed me and my daughter out of the house. All that followed was my husband's plaintive cries. I then drove my sister-in-law and niece to my parents-in-law's house and reported my husband to my parents-in-law's. When I told them that I had handed in the divorce papers and left, they promised that they would take care of the rest. They would make sure that my husband would never come near us again. My niece finally felt truly at ease after hearing her parents-in-law's words. My sister-in-law and niece will continue to live with my in-laws, and they will adjust their work and schooling, but my niece will probably have to change schools. I can't rule out the possibility that my husband will ambush my niece on her way to school. My daughter and I have also decided to return to my parents' home. During my husband's trip, I had been handling work, housework and childcare on my own, but my daughter is a strong girl and I felt that I could handle it well enough on my own. I could live with my daughter without my husband. Those 4 hellish days certainly gave me confidence. My parents are kind enough to let me live at home for a while, but I am thinking of moving closer to work before my daughter starts primary school. We each started anew in this way, but only my husband was still haunted by the past. Thanks to my parents-in-law, the divorce was finalized without my husband ever seeing me, but he continued to call me and eventually came to see me at my parents' house. My husband, who was supposed to have already been cut off from me, my daughter and the residents of my in-laws' house, including my parents-in-laws, was still insistent on getting back together with me. I can't imagine my life without Tara and Stella. I could no longer feel anything but fear in my husband's words. I asked my parents to contact the police and have them take my husband away, who kept shouting at the door. My husband was given a restraining order by the police and finally seemed to understand that he had become alone. It was too late to grieve now, even though it was he who had destroyed everything. How is my husband, who was a full-time house husband, going to make a living? It's none of my business. My daughter looked depressed for a while because of this incident, but recently she has finally started to smile again. She and her husband have divorced, but she still keeps in touch with my sister-in-law and niece, and they have started to smile together. We are in the process of planning an upcoming trip to a theme park for the 4 of us to override my niece's memories of the theme parks, which have been ruined. I hope to create many more happy memories for my daughter.